Hi, I'm Jason Cherry. Been reenacting for almost 30 years now, believe it or not, since I was about 10. And most recently been portraying young George Washington. And basically, like I said here, with this event being so close to where Washington traveled through, I figured best to talk a little bit about how young George Washington, like I said, 21 years of age at the time, and his 47-year-old guide, Christopher Gist, traveled with him. Like I said, a lot's really known later, and especially later in George Washington's life, because we know about, being the first president and, leading the American Revolution. And but what we don't, like I said, what's little known or what's out there, basically, George basically came through this way, traveled this way almost 500 miles, one way from Williamsburg, Virginia, to the whole way to Fort LeBoeuf, where he came in December the 11th, 1753, and delivered a summons basically to the French general Lagardier Saint-Pierre, and told him in basically in unknown certain terms that, in fact, this land here belonged to the English, and he'd heard about it through the King of Great Britain, and also that it not only belonged to the colony of Virginia, but also to the King of Great Britain, who Lagardier Saint-Pierre also responded with basically a summons of his own, and basically said that, through the Sailor Run expedition there in 1749, and through even explorations of LaSalle, that the Ohio country is what they called it this here, down to almost the Ohio River Valley to the Mississippi, down to New Orleans, all belonged to the French. And for this was basically the turning point for George Washington, because this journey alone that he traveled basically would get him later in life, and for what he would face, just being 21 years of age later on, to, like I said, the endeavors he would face basically later in life. For George Washington, yes, he had some experience. He was a surveyor for Lord Fairfax here when he was younger, about 16 years of age, but that was his only sense of basically wilderness. His only sense of seeing a fort was when his older half-brother Lawrence Washington was sick, and they sailed to Barbados to hopefully cure him of his ailments. And Washington actually, there's actually a journal online through the Mount Vernon site and numerous places that George described seeing his first fort in Barbados, which in fact, actually doing the research on it, I believe in it, most of it is still there today that he actually witnessed and saw, and even describes, seeing what the fort looked like then, and sort of, as you can see, is sort of from a surveyor's eye with him, was sort of amazed from what he saw, and I think that sort of interested him later on. But on this, like I said, on this journey, he traveled north here in 1753. He left October 31st, 1753, commissioned as a major. He had already been somewhat of a major, working as an adjutant in not only the southern neck county sort of area of Virginia, but also the northern neck where he resided. But in that area there, Washington basically took this as a challenge. Nobody really wanted to volunteer going north into sort of uncharted wilderness. Like I said, he took it as a challenge. His long life goal was basically to get a commission in the King's Army. His older half-brother had done it, and this was always his goal. And, fortunately for us later in history, we're sort of fortunate he didn't get this. Otherwise, the American Revolution might have been a little bit different. But on this journey, Washington was told by Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia that he would get the services of an older, experienced guide that had already explored the Ohio country, knew most of the trails throughout the forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh is today, and anywhere basically north of what he called Will's Creek or the inhabitants, because above that there really wasn't much as far as settlements. There might have been a few listed there. I know William Trent had written in a journal that usually near the inhabitants there might have been several families within 20 miles, but nothing really as far as settlements since then, unless you're heading to the south towards Virginia. So basically, this was a challenge where, an unknown, basically only some surveying experience, and George Washington, traveling on the edge, was going to travel almost through the wilderness. And as he was doing this, he's doing this almost toward the edge of winter here. and would not arrive until, like I said, December the 11th, 1753, and we're looking at almost 2 months of travel through, trails and getting treacherous as he's heading more north, especially almost in the dead of winter there. And it just imagine just going through there. I mean, he did most of it on the way up by horseback, a little bit different on the way back, but to George Washington, it was probably a little bit just seeing everything. I mean, what I'm wearing right now is basically what they call his formal attire. It would probably not have been something he would have worn the whole way up, especially traveling. He soon found out later that boots probably weren't the best thing to be wearing traveling that much by horseback or even walking, especially since majority of the time Washington probably purchased boots just before he left, so it's like wearing brand new shoes and knowing full well that you'd have to break them in, and probably a 500-mile journey through wilderness is probably not the best way to do it. And especially since back in the colonial times, boots weren't left and right; they were just straight, and you had to mold to your feet. So even more so. But basically, like I said, this attire that I'm wearing here basically was a formal attire. The red was basically representative not only of the colony of Virginia, but also just the colors of Great Britain. Like I said, he had the riding boots. He wore what they called a gorget. Basically came back from like the medieval times where it was more worn around the neck. And basically was just to signify that he was sort of the person in charge. It probably, I would suggest, probably not another smart thing to be wearing in the woods, knowing full well that not only the French but also the Indians that were residing in the woods would definitely know that he would probably be somewhat of a man of importance. Same thing with the sash, basically just showing the, like I said, the officer of rank or the person on duty. And even though he was considered, what they called a diplomat, the Indians and French probably didn't care about that or didn't care to know that he was just here just for diplomacy. They just saw him as sort of an invader. So basically, like I said, the formal attire would have probably would have been tried to dress closer to what Christopher Gist was wearing. Basically, something like I said, the boots was one thing, as you see with Christopher Gist. He's more of wearing what they call like the high-low shoes or sort of what they call half boots. More attired with that. I mean, like I said, it's something easier, lighter that might have been easier to wear. You're wearing sort of a hunting shirt that sort of blends in a little bit better in the wilderness, or at least in the snow, than wearing bright red, scarlet through there. He also, like I said, he had the hat was. We have the three-cornered hats that we're wearing. There was many ways to actually wear it. The majority, when you got a hat blank, it was, like I said, it was just basically a round hat and just a whole round the whole way around. And usually the reason why they moved it up and put the corners up was when they were drilling, it was easier so the musket wouldn't hit that every time. And with a flat hat, like how Christopher Gist has, it would probably just knock over keep hitting the flap of the hat. Whereas if you put them up, and it would form three corners, and it would protect you at least from knocking your hat off every time you were trying to drill. Now, obviously, this was more weather appropriate. If it's raining, it's going to protect you a little bit better than this right here being up and doing that. But that's basically the origin of that. Like I said, we would have probably carried some bags and different things on the way up, mostly supplies. For Washington, might even been the attire that he would have been wearing, or what I'm wearing right now, considering he probably didn't change until he actually arrived at the French fort. Now, he didn't just, with Christopher Gist and just Washington, it wasn't just the two of them. There was almost up to 12 people that traveled on this sort of caravan. When he left Wills Creek, he did eventually go to Logstown, which was a place that was about 18 miles up the Ohio River from Pittsburgh, or the Forks of the Ohio. And basically, he was able to talk to the Half King, or Tanacharison, and basically talk to him about leading him up north, because he'd already visited there a few months earlier and would probably know at least an easier path, possibly even better than Gist, mainly because the Half King had been there, and Christopher Gist knew some of the paths, but probably not as well as the Half King. They also acquired more Indian guides with them, and also 4 what they called servitors from inhabitants, or from the Wills Creek that traveled with them, mostly Indian traders and hunters that could also hunt for them, so they wouldn't have to worry about meat and different things. So traveling up in a large caravan, like I said, it was probably as quiet and as secretive as they tried to be, to try to go north to sort of, as Dinwiddie put, almost more to spy on the and get a reconnaissance work of the French. They probably weren't as secretive as they thought, coming that far north and traveling with that many people. They were able to, as they got closer to this area here as we're talking, basically George Washington would stop at what he called the outpost at Venango. That's where Franklin, Pennsylvania is today, which would be the first sort of French outpost. They had actually taken over a house of a trader named John Fraser, who actually would end up living closer to Turtle Creek and eventually near where Braddock's defeat would be in 1755. But John Fraser's house, which was right on the French Creek there, right on in Venango, basically was what they used as the building. And Washington even describes in his journal saying that the French were very hospitable to him. In fact, he even tried to hand the summons to Jean Quier, the commander there, who refused it and said that the higher ranking officer was basically a little further north. So George sort of tried to get away with not traveling a little further north, but unfortunately he eventually had to travel even further, and of which the Half King even suggested that they go sort of a different route, mainly because at that point, as it's getting closer to November and early December, as Half King put it, there were large miry savannas, even swamps that were hard, especially now with it being, it's not necessarily snowing, but they were getting like freezing rain and different things like that. It was hard to travel with the horses, and they weren't sure as far as how treacherous it was north. So they eventually did arrive at Fort LeBoeuf. Fort LeBoeuf was eventually the second outpost that the French built. The first being Fort Presqu'Isle, where around Presqu'Isle State Park is today in Erie. And then, like I said, Fort LeBoeuf was the second. Third was Venango, and Washington eventually would actually explain in his journal, eventually to letters to Dinwiddie, that the French were intending to build a fourth and a fifth fort eventually. Their actual fourth fort they had mentioned was supposedly at Logstown, which is where Washington already stopped before, and actually even mentioned, I think, a little bit, talking about that a couple of the French traders had already moved in. Eventually, it would be about a month or two later, French soldiers would come in actually and arrive at Logstown and sort of, as you could say, put up shop a little bit. And then they talked about a fifth one on the mouth of Beaver Creek, almost where Rochester, PA is eventual thing for that. They actually didn't intend to build at the Forks of the Ohio and basically near Pittsburgh, only because the only reason they did eventually do that is because they heard the English were building there as well. And that was sort of changed. Plus, as the French would eventually comment about the company of William Trent, another Indian trader, their craftsmanship was sort of second to none. So why tear something down and just build there if they're going to already build it for us? As far as that. But Washington, like I said, was faced with disappointment when he arrived at the French fort there at Fort LeBoeuf, where Waterford, PA is, and eventually had to hurry back. He had to be quicker than he basically came up. So his decision is that him and Gist would end up traveling back. Basically, they abandoned the horses, took what they could carry, probably a little bit of food, and left the Indians behind, and the rest of their guides behind, and just Christopher Gist and him returned back. At this point, they're sort of moving faster. In Washington, there's several times in his journal that he writes, or even what Christopher Gist, who also kept a journal, wrote, the travel was getting worse. We're talking, December. We're getting to the end of December here. And several times, those boots were finally coming out in the open here, because several times in each journal, they were talking, we had to stop because Major Washington's feet were tired. Or even Washington even admits that his feet were sore. They had to stop for the night. Eventually, he decides it's probably smarter to, do something like what Christopher Gist is wearing, and he actually decides to, as he called it, dress like an Indian, where he sort of, ditched the boots and basically wore leggings and also wore moccasins, which he found were a lot more comfortable than the fitted boots that he was trying to wear, sort of wear down. So he took that with him, and they traveled. As they're coming through, there were two different significance. We always try to do this in our talks, is basically that, believe it or not, there were two instances that this could have changed history as we know it. About 2 days after Christmas, on December the 27th, 1753, George Washington and Gist, traveling through the area there, meet an Indian who greets Christopher Gist immediately and calls him by his Indian name, Anasana. And Gist, right at the approach, acknowledges him, but both are sort of suspicious according to their journals, because it's amazing how in all this woods, how this Indian was able to find them and even know Gist right off the bat. Now Gist had even had his knowledge basically from day one, because he wrote in his journal that he recognized the Indian when they had traveled up at Venango. It'd probably been one of the Indians that had seen him come to the French fort and probably had been sitting in the back and, had sort of, examining Washington and Gist when they were there. The Indian at that time basically says he knows the quickest way to where they're trying to go, or even says to his cabin, as he puts, saying that they're close to the this Indian's cabin and that they could stay there a night if so, because Washington's goal at this point is to hopefully go to John Fraser's cabin across the Monongahela there and purchase a horse so they can ride the way back and be a little quicker. The Indian says he knows the fastest way back. They keep following him. The Indian at first offers to carry Washington's pack, which Washington is more than happy to give him. Hey, if he wants to carry it, why not? But the Indian asked to also carry his gun, and which Washington at this point, he has little experience, but he's not dumb either. And he's not going to hand him his gun, so he keeps the gun and lets the Indian, and the Indian starts going a different way to a point that Gist realizes they're not going to the south as where they exclaimed, and they're actually going more northern and actually out of the way. And their suspicions are starting to go at this point, and every time they ask the Indian how close they are, he would say, well, we're only a crow fly away, or we're only this. He's not really describing where they were going. At this point, we're not really sure what's going to happen, because Gist could suspect that he could be leading them to another party of Indians. He could be leading them to maybe French that were in the woods. So at this point, as the Indian starts to drift further and further away, and as Washington describes and as does Gist, in the middle of the night, as they're traveling through, the Indian was about 15 steps ahead of them, actually turns and fires on Washington and Gist. Frankly, for history, the bullet missed, and the Indian actually runs to, as Gist puts it, as the white oak tree. And now Gist's immediate retaliation, especially with experience in the Ohio country, is draw out the tomahawk and basically get rid of this Indian once and for all. But Washington actually intervenes and says, we can't kill the Indian, because if this happens, we're just going to be chased the whole time. I mean, at this point, it's been snowing. They'd be easy to track, especially if the Indian's found. And of course, if they were near this actual party that possibly maybe the Indian was leading them to. So at this point, Washington decided to let him go. They actually follow him, let him go off into the wilderness there. Gist and Washington actually follow him for a little bit, just to make sure that he's not leading them somewhere, and then they take off as quick as they can go. Unfortunately, they're trying to get to finally the Allegheny River, about 3 or 4 miles north of Pittsburgh, mostly probably around Lawrenceville area. And as they're going across, their worst fear is, because they had hoped that the river was frozen over and they could walk just across it. Unfortunately, the river is not frozen over, but there are chunks of ice going back and forth through. The water's pretty turbulent as far as everything. So Washington and Gist decide, well, the best way to get across then is we have to build a raft. Unfortunately, with the stuff that they're carrying, or just enough that they're carrying, as Gist puts it, they had one dull hatchet between the two of them, and they spent most of the day just hacking at the trees to try to make one wooden, basically a stick-laden raft, with long setting poles to sort of act as the oars. As they go across the river there, Washington describes it that it was, they were trying to lodge the ice out of the way, and also the strong currents of the river at this point being that this is December the 30th, 1753. They decide that, as he's doing it, he puts his setting pole in a little bit deeper just to see, to make sure, the depth of the water, and just to maneuver across. And as he does that, his pole gets sort of caught underneath the raft, and it flings Washington into the water. And you can only imagine, like I said, it's late December, falling into the Allegheny River and wearing nothing but probably a hunting shirt, leggings and moccasins. Luckily, Gist is able to pull him up, because Washington was at least able to grab onto the raft as he fell in. They both were, like I said, he reached into the water to grab Washington. At this point now, as he describes it, Gist's fingers are basically frostbitten, they're turning. Washington's freezing and could get, at this point, be hypothermia. So they realize they're not going to be able to make it the whole way across the river. So they find an island right in the middle of the river. And fortunately for them, were able to build a fire that night and actually dry themselves out and avoid doing this. And like we always said, it's amazing though, within a span of almost 4 or 5 days, Washington had 2 basically near-death experiences that could have changed history as we know it. Because if he doesn't deliver that message, basically with the disappointment back, Dinwiddie doesn't, has to find another officer to send out. And then hopefully this could have changed everything as far as with the, the start of the French-Indian War, or what would have happened, because it would have delayed knowing what was going on. But like I said, in this journal and journey that he did, Washington, like I said, kept a journal the entire time. In fact, you can actually, like I said, you can read that online in George Washington's papers. And he goes through in detail pretty good. Now, Christopher Gist also wrote a journal, and you can tell, being that he had more experience, because he gives into more detail, even giving how many miles they went that day, some of the trees and stuff that they witness, or wildlife that they see, in addition to what Washington says. And it's funny, because at this point, Washington was basically was unknown. He had done some surveying work, but really his name wasn't really out there. And if there was any time that this would be a good time his name to be out there, it was this time, because at this point, he submitted his journal to the governor, who had it published not only through Europe and London, but also throughout the colonies. And at this point, George Washington, everybody's asking who this George Washington was that, came through the wilderness and came through this area here and made a name for himself. And at that point, like we always said, if they had a New York Times bestseller list, George Washington would have been #1 on that list, just because of that journal. So, but like I said, at this point, we just try to promote this, not only, like I said, in any of the areas that George Washington came through, because it's amazing. At this point in Western Pennsylvania, everybody just associates George with, Virginia and Mount Vernon and everything. But here, like I said, in this area, it's amazing that, literally we're walking in the footsteps of, a young, less famous George Washington, but not only through, here, this area, but, towards Waterford and down through even Butler County, where he was shot at. I mean, the area where he was actually shot at by the Indian, they're not really sure exactly where, but they think it was between a place called Harmony or Zelienople, in Butler County. And then, like I said, they pretty much figure the island is somewhere around, about 3-4 miles north of the Forks of the Ohio, or what is Pittsburgh today. Closer to what they call the 40th Street Bridge or Washington's Crossing. It may not necessarily have been there, obviously. And it might have been easier, too, if that bridge had been there. Then they wouldn't have had to worry about crossing the ice. But anything else? We good?
Just one thing I do want to say about Erica and Jason. They sort of grew up together as reenactors, both dads and moms and other brothers and sisters. We were all together. And now, Erica's at Fort Ligonier promoting history. Jason and I are doing a lot of programs. I took this into the classroom for 35 years. And one funny story I have to tell you before we stop here is I was doing a little kindergarten class in Grove City. And I had a sign, and some of you folks have seen the sign, Washington Trail, 1753, with the silhouette. And it started, their ultimate goal was to do this from Williamsburg all the way up to Fort LeBoeuf. That's going to happen, I'm hoping. So anyway, this little girl puts her hand up. She's 5, 6 years old, puts her hand up and says, "Mr. Cherry, I have a question. I think I know why George Washington never got lost on the way up to the French forts." I said, "Why, honey?" He had that sign on every tree saying, "That's the way I go." So you do hear a lot of great things from the kids, and we appreciate the people coming to learn about Washington, because when we do a lot of programs, believe it or not, people say to him, "Where's George Washington? I don't see his white hair." And George will respond and say, "Ma'am, I'm only 21 years old. My hair has not turned yet." And another story is funny. Is like, we're talking about it, and this little boy says to me, I said, "Think how history would have changed. Washington's almost shot near Butler County, almost killed there. Then he falls into the Allegheny River, how things would change, And he's thinking, and this is a little second grader, and he's thinking, yeah, wouldn't have been a Revolutionary War general, wouldn't have been our first president, wouldn't have married Martha, wouldn't have gone on this terrible trip. And the worst thing is, he'd have never got a chance to pose for the dollar bill." So they totally think. And again, I want to thank Erica and all the people that are into living history. Now, Jason's 2 girls, they're 6 and 3. We're now 3 generations into history. They love doing this. And hopefully, and I even have a son in South Carolina who his wife is from Slovakia, and she wants to do this now. So we really have them brainwashed. But thanks, everyone. And I don't know, Major, if you have anything else to say.
No, I said if anybody has any questions, that's pretty much, we'll leave it up to that. So. Yes.
Where can you, or the journals, Washington's journals, where are they kept?
Like the originals?
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, as far as the like original, I believe that like you can actually read the Washington papers and everything at the Library of Congress actually, and like I said, through their website you can actually read everything from his early times from being a surveyor up till traveling to Barbados, up till almost the end of his presidency, and almost to the death in 1799.
Okay, so Library of Congress.
Yeah, you can go through there. Yeah.
Their website. It's all online.
Yep.
But the actual documents are there in Washington. Yeah, some.
Yeah, not most of them, but yeah, majority of them are, yes.
And the place that you were talking about, where he was, he crossed the river and he fell in.
Yes.
Is that where you're talking about, like between Zealy and Opal and?
No, the place where he crossed the Allegheny was only about 4 or 5 miles north of Pittsburgh. So the where he got shot at was between Harmony and like Zealy and Opal area in Butler County. And then when he crossed the river and fell in, it was, like I said, it was around where it's what it's called, Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania, for those of you familiar with the Pittsburgh area. But it's mostly, they're not sure exactly where. I mean, there's been a lot of theories on what island it was or if it's still there, but it's basically it was a few miles north of Pittsburgh where he actually crossed. Yes, in the back.
It's not really a question, but the Washington's diary was used for David Meade to come up here. He saw that there was meadows that the Indians created in Meadville, and that's what brought him up here.
Yeah, it's amazing a lot of that how much stuff is influenced, especially later, the early stuff that he wrote. Yes?
George Washington was always extremely self-promoting. So I'm wondering if guests in Washington's journals completely mirror one another, or if there's any differences.
It's comparing. They pretty much are. I mean, I know back a few years ago. I don't know how many years ago was Kevin Copper's book. Yeah, 10 or 15 years ago. One of the guys that he worked as a grad student, was also a student at Slippery Rock, actually combined both journals, and so you could see them on the same date. So if it was like November the 15th, they had what Washington wrote and what Gist wrote, sort of to compare. Judging, like we've read both going through, we feel Gist was a little bit more in detail. I mean, Washington didn't take time to discover like, oh, we passed some white oaks and redbud. Washington basically said, we traveled this far today, we were tired, or Gist did something, or they were able to eat bear or something like that. It didn't really go into too much detail, whereas like I said, in addition, Christopher Gist being the person that's been on the frontier a lot and saw everything, he made sure to do close detail, especially for when they got up. Now, when Washington did arrive at the French forts, he talked about in great detail at Venango and also basically at Fort LeBoeuf, even describing to Dinwiddie that he saw 220, dug canoes already ready for supposedly when the spring came, for them to come down when the creeks and rivers thawed, that they could come down and hopefully take what they called the upper Ohio country there, either Pittsburgh area or, like I said, Logstown, which was about 18 miles north.
Was he being paid by the Ohio company?
It was sort of a matter of, for that trip, he was actually commissioned by the governor the year before in 1752 and also 1751 and even a little bit of 1750. He was paid by the Ohio company to survey and sort of scout out the lands even in the lower Ohio country, which was like the true state of Ohio today. But then as when it came to that Washington was going to be the person that's going to be traveling north with the message and to sort of spy on the French and see what kind of numbers they had with the forts, Gist was the one that Dinwiddie recommended, knowing he worked for the Ohio company before. So when they probably commissioned him, it was probably commissioned from the colony of Virginia is how he was paid. Mm-hmm.
Also, we have brochures of Washington's trip in pretty good detail, what he did on this date, and you're welcome to have one. I'll just leave them up here on the stage and we can go from there. If there's any other questions, go ahead.
Yes.
How did they know how far they traveled? Did they actually measure it or count the steps?
Yeah, I mean, it's being that both of them were sort of former surveyors. I mean, I think they sort of judged on what it was. I don't think they actually, I mean, As far as the mileage and stuff, I mean, to a point, I think, like I said, Gist had even admitted that when they went into Ohio country even a year before that, he carried a compass, but he didn't want to show the Indians because he was worried that they would see something, foreign to them and would, basically think it as something evil or something. So he basically kept that hidden. So they probably kept almost like a compass as well. And then probably their knowledge of being in the wilderness and knowing which way was north. And because there was, like I said, there were a lot of times in the journal, Gist would say, we traveled 15 miles north and 5 miles west. And I mean, they knew at least approximately, or I mean, it may not have been of exact, but at least within a couple miles and where they were going, so.
Is it true he died from bloodletting?
George Washington? Pretty much, yes. What they basically died of was basically a throat infection. He was, believe it or not, after all that experience in, this way north, 1753, and then stuff that happened in 54, Braddock's defeat in 1755, and then eventually all the stuff in the American Revolution. Washington was riding out in the rain, just looking over his lands and stuff, like we would, right if it was pouring rain, and came back, started developing a cough, sort of got a cold, sort of spread to his throat. And unfortunately, there weren't antibiotics then, so at that point, their initial thing, they had 3 doctors look at him. Dr. Craik, James Craik was his person that was with him ever since in 1754, lived close to a point that they were so close together, he was always this personal doctor. James Craik big thing was that was what they thought to get the, sort of the bad blood out. They did the bloodletting with the leeches. It didn't take according to they tried to do it and it didn't work because he didn't feel any better. They tried it again, and one of the doctors actually suggested a tracheotomy, which at that point, according to the thing, wasn't even common then. It was just something that was experimental. So at that point, especially with somebody that had already been the first president, I think they all sort of met and were like, I don't think that's something we want to sort of just try out and see what happens. So unfortunately, but they claim, I mean, at least in medical journals, that if that had happened, he probably would have survived. But at that point, there was really nothing they could do, and like I said, that ended up. Eventually, it just became what like I said, what they call it, basically almost like a throat infection. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason.